And as they head back, first off, I want to just commend each of them. What wonderful manners. Thank you for saying thank you. Let me invite you to please rise as we hear our gospel lesson today. We're reading out of Matthew 10. It's on page 791 if you would like to follow along in your pew Bibles. Matthew 10, beginning with verse 40. Jesus said, "Whoever welcomes you welcomes me, and whoever welcomes me welcomes the one who sent me. Whoever welcomes a prophet in the name of a prophet will receive a prophet's reward, and whoever welcomes a righteous person in the name of a righteous person will receive the reward of the righteous. And whoever gives even a cup of cold water to one of these little ones in the name of a disciple, truly I tell you, none of these will lose their reward." Friends, this is the gospel of the Lord. I invite you to please be seated. So we're going to continue with our series this summer on Paul's love letters, and we're going to be focusing on that scripture from Romans that we heard just a little bit ago. And, reading Paul can sometimes be, well, it's kind of like wading through an entire swamp of marshmallows. It gets to be very, very dense, and sometimes you can kind of get lost in all of it. So we're just going to highlight a couple of the things that Paul had to say for us today. And we start with just a reminder of one of my all-time favorite stories. In just a few days, I leave for West Virginia with 41 other fantastic people. A few of them are here, and I'm glad for that. It's that season of the year, and I'm glad for it. We've already had a couple of our trips go out and come back, and I'm excited for that. And this season of trips and camps reminds me of one of my all-time favorite Mike Yaconelli stories. Yaconelli was that legendary youth minister who influenced several generations of youth workers, including myself, in large part because Mike did it all himself. Mike was a pioneer in youth ministry, even before youth ministry was a thing. And I remember, I heard him tell this story many times, a story about taking a group of kids to camp, many of whom were not necessarily church kids, as was evident late one night. That night, camp was settled, it was quiet, and Mike was awakened by the sound of one of his boys yelling a profanity over and over again. And as Mike told the story, he was very creative. So Mike got up to see what was going on, and he found that there had been a group of kids who had been running through camp, and as they were doing so, this young man was sleeping on the side of the tent, and as they went by his tent, they accidentally kicked him in the back of the head. He woke up suddenly, and those were the words that came out. And after they had settled everybody down, the camp director came over to Mike and said very sternly, "We can't have this." And his response surprised her, because Mike said, "Isn't it great? Of all the places for him to lose his cool, he was here in camp with us. What a great place for this to happen." The camp director did not share his enthusiasm. And so they talked about it for a while, and Mike said, "You're right. When we went over the rules for camp, we forgot to mention that if you get kicked in the head in the middle of the night, you should not say the F word." And as I thought about it this week, I realized I have never had that as a part of any of our covenants either. But I don't think I'm going to. See, I don't think we need a rule for that. In all honesty, I don't think we need to have as many rules surrounding us as we do. For example, if you look at, say, the Little League Baseball rule book, it's about this thick. It's a lot of rules for a game for kids. Look at the tax code. Significant rules. Even traffic laws. Major rulage. We are surrounded by a lot of rules. And it's because of that to me it's small wonder that we have a tough time accepting God's free gifts. I think we have a hard time with that because we're so used to having special conditions, special exceptions. We're used to looking for the fine print that says, this doesn't apply to you. We forget that faith isn't about getting it right. It's about realizing the truth of the gospel of Christ and discovering an invitation that will lead, perhaps, to living differently. We're invited into an unconditional way of living, where your value, the way you view others, the way you make decisions, where those things aren't based on fear of judgment by some unforgiving demands of an angry God who is constantly looking for people to make mistakes. That's not how we're invited to live. But instead, we're invited to live in such a way that your value of yourself and others, your decisions, your very approach to the world are shaped by a gift of life and hope that you can't help but want to share and to extend. You can't help it. That's what Paul was talking about when he talked about being enslaved to God or being slaves of righteousness. Now, Paul was not a big fan of describing people as slaves. But, as he says, I understand you have limitations, so I'm going to speak in human terms. And I'm trying not to take that personally as an insult. But Paul knew that he needed some sort of analogy, some sort of comparison, so that we could understand what it is to be a Jesus follower and how closely we should be following Christ's mission in the world. Paul's argument is, just as people can be drawn and connected and can become slaves to sin, he also believed that people can be equally, if not more, drawn and connected and slaves to righteousness. And then he goes on to say, whichever way it is, I can tell you that only one of those leads to life, eternal and otherwise. If Paul would have had access to Twitter, he would have tweeted something like, be the slave of the world that you want to live in and serve that vision with all that you have. Because he understood that a slave to grace is someone who is bound by the terms of grace, forgiveness, life, hope. In this case, a slave is actually someone who's truly free to share, free to live. Paul says, slaves to the law, they actually have it tough because they're caught up in an endless loop of scorekeeping, making sure that every T is crossed, every I is dotted, and that doesn't sound like much of a life. It actually sounds pretty deadly to me. Living a life under the law is complicated. It's hard. It becomes its own full-time job as you're making sure that everything you do, you're doing exactly right, and that you never once step off whatever that path may be. I'm thankful that here, for example, we baptize infants because it's a great reminder for those of us who are no longer infants that this gift of life is given as a free gift. It's not an earned reward. Like I was talking about with the kids, a gift is a gift. It doesn't come with preconditions. When we baptize infants, we recognize this is a free gift from God that comes before we can do anything about it. It's not conditional upon our acceptance or our perfection or even our ability to follow the rules. When we're baptized, we're invited into a mystery. We receive a new life, even as a baby. And we really have no idea how that journey is going to go. And so as we collectively gather around the font with children, we can only imagine where they're going to go in their lives. We don't know the songs that they'll sing, the teams they'll be on, the people they'll influence, the activities they'll be a part of. We don't know what passions are going to stir them to action and guide them into service. But we do know this, that God is present for them now, even when they don't understand it. And even more, we recognize God is present in their future as well. And then we all get to watch and to wait with great anticipation as each person discovers their unique adventures in faith. And that not knowing part, that's where we get nervous. That's where sometimes we even get a little fearful. And that's when we start to write the rules that I don't think God ever intended for us to write about how we're supposed to live, or else. Or exactly what we're supposed to believe, or else. Or how we're supposed to dress, or else. Or even the language we're supposed to use when we're kicked in the head in the middle of the night at camp, or else. And friends, when we start writing those rules, once again, we become slaves to the law. And we find ourselves back in that circumstance. And friends, when we do that, all of that freedom, all of that unpredictability, all of the joy of not knowing what God's going to do next, all of those things go right out the window because we are trying to keep God very much domesticated and contained. We forget that it's Jesus who leads in our life's dance, not us. Author and speaker Rob Bell, another one of my favorites, compares living faithfully to jumping on a trampoline. We have our beliefs, we have our doctrines, we have our rituals, we have our traditions. All of those things serve as the springs on a trampoline. They keep it in place. They give it form. They give it some stability. They hold the trampoline together to be sure. But when we jump, as we live our lives, we discover those springs, the doctrines, beliefs, rituals, traditions that we know. We find that those springs start to stretch. They change shape a little bit. And we realize those springs aren't the trampoline. And just to dig a little bit more into the metaphor, we realize those springs aren't God. They're the statements that we make about our faith. They help give words and expressions to things we can't fully express or describe ourselves. And the trampoline is that place where our daily experience encounters those springs, and we find ourselves interacting with them, constantly bending, molding, and shaping who we are and what they do. And we find that together we're propelled by this invisible God who loves us and who invites us to keep jumping. The springs help give definition and shape to something that goes beyond expression and description. In college, I wrote my senior thesis on a story by Flannery O'Connor called A Good Man is Hard to Find, one of my all-time favorite short stories by one of my all-time favorite authors. And in that story, and in many of Flannery O'Connor's stories, as she writes, she shares the inner thoughts and feelings of her main characters until they have a moment of direct experience of God. And when they have that moment, when they have that experience, she stops providing those inner thoughts and those inner feelings of her characters. Instead, she starts just to give a list of actions. In that moment, when we're locked out of those thoughts and feelings, we recognize that they are experiencing something that words can't describe. And as great of an author as Flannery O'Connor was, she knew she couldn't provide those words. She didn't even try to describe those things. The word I used throughout my paper was ineffable, that is, incapable of being expressed. Friends, when we live our lives of faith, there are many moments that can't be expressed or described. We do our best, but we can't come up with all of the words. And there's freedom in that. There's freedom in understanding that God goes beyond our words. There's freedom in recognizing that God's ways are not our ways. But that freedom disappears when we allow our doctrines, our beliefs, our rituals, those things we say about our faith to become rigid and hard, unmoving, unbending. Because when that happens, we find ourselves, instead of being on a trampoline, we find ourselves constructing a brick wall, inflexible, unwelcoming, with no movement or life to it. In a brick wall, the removal of even one brick can disrupt the entire system. it's actually much more fragile than a trampoline. We have to be careful around it, cautious not to dislodge any of the bricks. And then we find we've been contained by that brick wall. We cannot free ourselves. And so, folks, I offered you an invitation that's been offered for generations to live into this good news of freedom. You're invited, not because you're perfect and not because you ever will be, but just because you are. And that invitation comes without any prerequisites. There's nothing you're supposed to know. There's no particular way you're supposed to behave. There's no experience you have to have first. It's an open invite to a life of freedom. And in that life of freedom, we'll find ourselves being led into a deeper, growing relationship with Christ that gives plenty of room for exploring, for experimenting, for discovering. Thanks be to God for this incredible gift. Amen.